dream today. I say to you today, my friends, that in spite of all the difficulties and frustrations of the moment, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at a table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream that one day little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls and walk together as sisters and brothers.
This is our hope. This is the faith with which I return to the South. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day.
When the El Paso Holocaust Museum prepared the passes for this evening's event, we had some discussion about how to go about distributing them. The question that kept coming up was, why bother to put seat numbers on the passes? If they're free, let everyone sit wherever they want. Could I get the house lights up, please? Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, look around. Look at your neighbors. Look behind you and in front of you. Without reserved seat numbers, we would have had large groups of people sitting together with lots of space between all the groups. We'd have had synagogue people over here, church people over there, my family on this side, your family on that. I would guess that we would have been separated in one manner or another. And I doubt that Dr. King would think favorably about that situation. Since this event is a celebration of his work, we thought we could demonstrate that 30 years after his death, his dream of brotherhood and equality is alive here in El Paso. So Ms. Loretta Buchanan, our Programs and Events Director, got to work, and for 3 days she's painstakingly separated the tickets for this entire auditorium. She went through. Then she shuffled the groups. She mixed them up so that as they were delivered around town, there were no more than 10 seats together, and tickets were distributed for seating in all sections of this theater. You can use this to your advantage by taking the opportunity to get to know the people sitting next to you. I imagine that Dr. King is smiling tonight to see that we have come together with few spaces between us. As president of the El Paso Holocaust Museum, I'm pleased and I'm proud to lead an organization that has such a positive mission. Our mission is to teach others what the consequences are when bigotry and racism are allowed to flourish unchecked. We don't discuss problems that have no solutions, and we don't battle windmills. Our goal is to expose as many people as possible to the facts about hate crimes and how they happen. The museum helps people understand through the power of displays, photos, books, speakers, and forums. We use any opportunity we can to educate others about how the power of friendship and brotherhood can defeat those who would oppress us. And we will be including plans to expand our museum to include other periods in history in which good people have been brutally sentenced to unspeakable cruelties. I'm happy to say that over 11,000 school children visited the museum last year, and we'll see many, many more this year. We don't know what kind of impact it will have on these kids as they get older. Many of them won't get it, but I know we'll reach some, and that means something. It's hard to join an organization preaching hatred and discrimination if you have a basic understanding that hatred of a person because of his religion or his skin color is unjust and ungodly. Through education and constant diligence on the part of each of us, I know we'll have fewer white supremacists and neo-Nazis in the future. I think Dr. King's message, if he were standing here tonight, would be that we, as neighbors and fellow citizens of this city, should pool our common resources, our energy, our brains, and through working together to begin to create the world that Dr. King dreamed of. Instead of competing with one another, instead of harboring feelings of jealousy, instead of looking at our activities in a narrow perspective of how it will serve my religious or ethnic identity with no regard for the community as a whole. Let's show that we are working together for peace and mutual understanding. Our speaker tonight, Mr. Morris Deese, is a lawyer. Now, don't jump to conclusions. He fights the bad guys. Mr. Deese is the co-founder of the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama, and he's earned a reputation for defending minority clients in cases involving violations of their civil rights. He has bankrupted many white supremacist movements in the United States through his successful lawsuits. Mr. Deese also devotes his time to educating people about America's radical militia movement. He is the author of the expose, Gathering Storm, America's Militia Threat, which explores the dangers that those groups represent. In a moment, El Paso's Mayor, Carlos Ramirez, would like to present a gift from our city to Mr. Deese in honor of his visit tonight. Before he does, I'd like to say that the El Paso Holocaust Museum, together with the Martin Luther King Jr. Committee of El Paso, bring you a man who fights for the dream every day, Morris Deese.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed an honor tonight to be here with you to celebrate the memory of Dr. Martin Luther King. I want to congratulate the people from the Holocaust Museum and the committee to celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King for putting this together. El Paso indeed is honored to present to him the key to the city. It's a token of our appreciation for all he has done for this country and our community.
Thank you for your hospitality and giving me the opportunity and honor to celebrate with you the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who, to ensure that America lived up to its promises of equality of 1776, had to overcome terrorists with no conscience, politicians with no backbone, and rivals, many from his own race, with no foresight. But today, it's not those who foolishly stood in this great man's way that we remember. It's the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, truly one of the greatest heroes of our nation. Dr. King and I grew up very close together, but very far apart in many ways. I grew up on a small cotton farm down in Montgomery, Alabama, We didn't own any land. We had a land that we farmed. We rented it from white people in the community. We worked along beside many black people in our community. I went to a Baptist church like Dr. King went to. But in the 1940s and 50s, when I grew up in rural Alabama, it was very segregated. In my little church, we learned many lessons of moral values. Some we followed, some we didn't. The same lessons were being taught by Dr. King's father in the same Baptist church he went to in Atlanta, Georgia. One black and mine white. And I remember one of my Sunday school teachers, among the many things she taught us, was that we little Baptist boys and girls, I assume, shouldn't drink alcoholic beverages. That was one of the things we had lessons on. Now, she was also my 5th and 6th grade teacher in a little school we had. And sometimes it was hard to see where religion began and school ended. Only about 75 people in that whole school. 15 started in my 1st grade and 13 of us graduated. And in one of the lessons, I can't remember honestly if it was in school or in church, but Mrs. Johnson said, you know, you shouldn't be using alcoholic beverages. And I said, but Mrs. Johnson, you just told us last week that Jesus turned water into wine. And she looked at me and she says, that's right, Morris. But we'd have thought a whole lot more of him if he hadn't have done that. But I remember in that little school, we went out front every morning if it wasn't raining. And we stood all around the flagpole and we raised our hand and we pledged allegiance to the flag in a similar way that we honored our flag today. And I remember how proud I felt to be an American standing there as the flag went up the pole. I was in Atlanta, Georgia at the opening ceremony of the Olympics when the flags from 191 nations was brought into that great arena. You may have seen it on television. People from those countries where those flags came from, many were at war with each other back home. But they put down the weapons of war to attempt on the field of athleticism to find peace and understanding. And I was so proud, as I'm sure you were too, when our little 5-person young women gymnastic team won a gold medal. You know, they had to overcome tremendous odds, competing against countries that they start teaching gymnastics to little kids 2 years old, Russia, China, Romania. And they also had to overcome severe physical handicaps and injuries, but in the end they persevered. And you know, I'll bet you that the hardest-hearted racist in this country cheered along with the rest of us when they played our national anthem and put the gold medals around those 5 young ladies without realizing that they represent in many ways the diversity of this nation. Because on that team was a black or African American girl, an immigrant, a young woman from Romania that had come here with her family, an Asian American girl, and others. But you know, the peace and dreams that was so embodied by that beautiful song that was the theme of the Olympics, The Power of the Dream, was shattered by someone, a mean-spirited person, who placed a bomb in the Olympic Village Park. And I was reading a letter about a week after that bomb was exploded, and it was in the USA Today magazine. And I clipped it out because I wanted to share it. It was a letter from a man from St. Louis. And he said that everyone was justifiably outraged and saddened by the bomb that exploded at the Olympics this weekend. But should we be so surprised, he wrote, We live in a society that thrives on exclusion, prejudice, and divisiveness. National, religious, and political leaders promote fear and intolerance. Is it any wonder then, he concluded, that frustration and anger and violence are the results? America, 30 years after Dr. King gave his life in the struggle for human rights, our nation is deeply divided. It's troubling to me that we're so divided. We're divided along a lot of lines. We're divided along the lines of gender, sexual orientation, class, economic lines, but we're probably divided the deepest in this country along racial lines. People of color on one side, and as you would say here, Anglos or whites on the other side. I think if you look at the O.J. Simpson case, it might be a lesson in that respect. Approximately 75% of people of African descent in this country said they believed that he was probably not guilty. And approximately 75% of the rest of us said he was probably guilty. But you know, we were looking at the same evidence. We got it from the same sources, television, newspapers, radio, but we were looking at that evidence through different eyes and through different experiences and through different expectations. There's a battle going on today in this nation. It didn't just start yesterday, but it's certainly been intensified. It was intensified when a young man who, for blatant racist reasons, believing that this nation should be a white America, Timothy McVeigh and his friends, following the Bible of a militia patriot movement, a little book called the Turner Diaries, talking about a race war in this nation, in which one day all people of color will be driven from this nation. A little book that he carried with him in the military. He sold it. He sold it at gun shows, and it was on the back seat of his car when he was arrested, leaving the scene of that bombing. A book that began with exploding 4,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate in front of a federal building in a truck bomb. This battle that I'm talking about is a battle over whose America is this, and whose version of America will prevail in the next millennium. I don't think that I could tell you a better example of this battle than to tell you about a case that I represented and the lawyers at the Southern Poverty Law Center, that we represented a family from Ethiopia who, like so many people before, sent their son to America to get an education and maybe become a citizen. This was a very poor family who had a small farm in the province of Gondor, and their 24-year-old son, Mulugata Sarar, who had a small son of his own and a wife, packed up his meager belongings, boarded a plane to Portland, Oregon, leaving his family behind to go to college. His friends told me that he had great hopes for his life in our country because he believed that America was a great nation, a land of opportunity for those who got a good education, who worked hard, who saved their money. And he started out to do that when he got to Portland. He got a job while still a student at the Avis Rent-A-Car Company. And his job was to drive people from the airport terminal in a bus out to where the cars are parked. And a lot of times people would leave an umbrella or a purse or something like that on his bus. And Mulugata, very kind and man and loyal to his employer and liking people, he'd try to get those items back to them, many times using money from his own pocket to send the items to their rightful owners. And for his kindness, his personnel file at Avis began to build up with good letters, and he was elected Employee of the Month. But there was another man that had a different idea about America and whose America this is. His name was Tom Metzger. Tom Metzger headed a group down in Southern California called the White Aryan Resistance. WAR, W-A-R. You've probably seen him on television, Oprah, Donahue, Sally Jesse Raphael. He'd run for Congress, had been beaten, decided at 55 years old that he would organize the skinheads around the country, little neo-Nazi bands of youth that go in the streets and beat up on minorities and others. His philosophy was that America is a great nation, but it won't be that way long unless we get these mud people, as he called it, out of this country. And mud people was anybody that wasn't Anglo like him. Jews, Americans of Asian descent, Americans of African descent, and others. And he sent his organizers out to teach these skinhead groups that unless we quickly get these people out of America, we're going to have problems, our great nation will fail, and we've got to get in the streets and stir up racial discord. We know them as hate crimes. And he sent one of his organizers up to Portland, Oregon, a young man, 21 years old, named Dave, who he had anointed vice president on one of these national talk shows. And Dave got there and began to meet with skinheads and give them Metzger's philosophy and the need to commit acts of racial terror in the streets. And about 3 weeks after he had been there, 3 of those skinheads who had been listening went out in the street one night around midnight, and they saw a young black man get out of a car and go across the lawn to an apartment building. He was Mulligata, coming home from Avis Rent-A-Car to get ready to go to school the next day. They rushed over, they punched him in the chest, they taunted him, they called him racist names, and he said, "Please, peace, no trouble." And while one continued to taunt him, another one walked around behind and hit him full force in the back of the head with a baseball bat and crushed his skull, and he died that night on the streets of Portland. The FBI and the local police quickly caught the 3 skinheads, and they got long prison sentences. I got a call from a person speaking for the family in Ethiopia, saying to see if we could find somebody to hold civilly responsible, because little Hinak Sarah back in Ethiopia and his mother were very poor, and Mulligata had been sending them money to take care of their daily needs. And I went to Portland and I met with the police, and they said, "Well, Mr. Dees, you know, these 3 skinheads, they don't have any money. You're not going to get anything from them. But you know, when we was looking in their room in a search warrant after the murder, we found a handwritten letter in Metzger's handwriting to those skinheads, and it said, when you meet Dave, our organizer, you will understand how we operate, and we hope that you'll join up with us. Signed, for a white America, Tom Metzger." Well, I had our investigators find young Dave. We found him in a day when he wasn't with Metzger. I flew to Los Angeles and talked to him, and fortunately he had some doubts about his life and how he had gotten to where he did in life, and he agreed that he would help us in a lawsuit against Metzger. Metzger's a good talker, had good lawyers, but he wanted to make some of his own arguments to the jury. I sent to Ethiopia and I brought little Hinak Sarah to come and sit at our council table. And he sat there through an interpreter listening to the trial, dressed in his native clothes. At that time of the trial, he was about 8 years old. Dave testified, and we put on a lot of evidence. At the end of the trial, Metzger stood before the jury, delivered his closing argument. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, my views are not popular, but in this country we have freedom of speech. I didn't tell these skinheads to do this. I was 1,200 miles away. I didn't even know who they were, and I certainly didn't know the victim. 3 men are already in jail. Why hold me civilly responsible?" I was concerned about that jury because what he said was accurate, at least about 3 people have been caught. And as I stood there for a moment and thought about Metzger's closing words to that jury, and they were, "America is great because of the contributions of white people." And then he had sat down. As I stood there, I thought, what could I say? Because that wasn't my view of this nation. I said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to look out on the first row of this courthouse, right behind Mr. Metzger's table, and there sits his 4 children. One of them testified in this trial. You know who they are. And do you know that none of his children had to worry about getting polio because of the genius of the Jewish doctor Jonas Salk, who invented the Salk vaccine." And I said, "Ladies and gentlemen, if we lived in Tom Metzger's America, we wouldn't have the brilliance of the black General Colin Powell." And I mentioned other people from other races and other nationalities. And I said, "You know, ladies and gentlemen of this jury, that the America that Tom Metzger believes in is an America that never existed, because our nation is great because of our diversity, not in spite of it." And I think that jury agreed with me with a resounding yes, because they returned the largest civil verdict ever returned in the state of Oregon, $12.5 million. Metzger didn't have $12.5 million, obviously. That's what the jury thought this was worth. But we have collected, we took his house and his property, and he has to pay money every month to little Heenan, and he right now is a mere shadow of himself. But you know, as I was riding to the airport, and I was beginning to think about what had happened out there, and I boarded that plane, and we got up about 30,000 feet, and I was looking down over the Rocky Mountains and flew across the Great Plains of this nation, over the Appalachian Mountains into Atlanta, Georgia, going to my farm back in Alabama. I thought to myself, I believe what I told that jury. That is my version of America. But if that's true, if we're great because of our diversity, and I truly believe that, then why are we having such a hard time getting along with each other in this nation? You know, I know these are generalizations, but we're divided, so deeply divided along racial lines in this country. And on either side of that divide, there's fear and anger and frustration. There are people of African descent and people of Hispanic Americans who say, and I think they certainly share in the dreams of Dr. King, who say that Dr. King and others of the civil rights movement in America came and said that America would live up to its promises of equality, and laws were passed. But you know, this place I work has a glass ceiling. I can only go so high, even though they say there's great opportunities here. And they say, look at Texaco, one of the greatest companies in this nation, one of the top 500 corporations, billions of dollars in sales and assets. A lawsuit was brought by a lawyer representing some black employees who said they'd been passed over for jobs even though they had more seniority and they were better qualified. And these lawyers asked Texaco, give us their personnel files. We know there's good stuff in there. And the lawyers at Texaco stonewalled. They wasn't getting the information until one day, an employee at Texaco, an executive, in fact, who no longer worked there, contacted those black plaintiffs' lawyers and handed him a cassette tape. You know, you saw it on television. And said, and this now wasn't a tape made in the oil fields on the loading docks. It was made in the highest executive offices of that great corporation. And on that tape, you could hear executives plotting and scheming the destruction of those documents needed to prove that case, and the racial epithets they used on that tape, I would not repeat here tonight. And you know, that exposure of that tape resulted in the largest settlement of a civil case for employment discrimination in the history of the nation, $186 million. Now, you know what? I can understand that anger and that frustration. And you know, when a lot of the people in this country of Americans of African descent voted the way they did in the polls concerning OJ, many of them might have had a belief in their heart that he may have been guilty, but what they were really voting on was our justice system. A system in which they saw Rodney King virtually beaten to death. Nobody could doubt it. You don't beat a dog like that. And the jury found the 4 white men who did it. An all-white jury found them not guilty. On the other side of that divide, that racial divide that separates us, and I know these are generalizations, but there are white people in this country who say, I also believe in what Dr. King preached and taught. I wasn't even born, first of all, back then. I didn't take anybody's rights, but I do believe in equal opportunity, but that's not what they want. What they want is a guaranteed slice of the pie, and that's un-American. I'm not for that. Fear, frustration, and anger. I think about those people dealing with that issue that confronts us so hard today, that issue of leveling the playing field. It's got a political buzzword attached to it now called affirmative action. Let me talk about that because I happen to be in Texas. I happen to be where the Hopwood decision came down. I happen to be in a state where the University of Texas, who has a fine and wonderful law school and a population of people of Hispanic descent and African descent and others who are no longer represented in that law school. And let me tell you a little story about affirmative action. Because I graduated from law school in 1960. I went to a poor little school, hardly had no good educational facilities. And when I got ready to go to law school, I didn't take an entrance test. I just had to have a C average in college. And when I got out of law school in 1960, I got in 58. I got out in 1960, I didn't have to take a bar exam. Because if you went to the University of Alabama Law School, you didn't take a bar exam. And Texas was the same way for a long time. But you know, in 1965, they entered a black person in our law school, and they changed all that. They changed it. But you know what? This was my affirmative action. It was the color of my skin. And you know what? Nobody complained about it then. Nobody said one word. So all I can say is this, on an issue that I know divides us so much in this country, is that we, none of us, would think it would be fair at the Olympics if a player who had to start a race with 10 pounds of lead hooked to his leg, or her leg. And that's why the playing field in things in athletics is level. I wish I knew the answer to that and other issues, because I don't believe in affirmative action any more than any black person or any Asian person or any woman. We believe in a level playing field. Nobody wants to feel like they got an opportunity because of their race or their sex, but they just like to have a fair shot. And I don't mean to brag, But I do believe that whatever credentials I had, I've been a pretty fair lawyer. And I think that we are excluding from our universities and our governmental agencies many people who have something that's so essential, at least in my profession, and that's a passion for justice. I wish I had an answer to give you today for the problems that divide us in this country. The President of the United States has set up a commission to create a dialogue on race in this country, and he was immediately criticized. But he'd be criticized if he didn't set up a commission. And I think it's important that regardless of the pros and cons, it's important that with this dialogue begin. It should, though, begin everywhere in our country, in our churches, in our businesses. It should begin in county and city governments and on the state level. And I hope that that will be the legacy of this commission, not 60 pages that are bound up and sent out. Because I think we know the problem. At the Southern Poverty Law Center, we have a project called Teaching Tolerance, because we learned that fighting hate in courtrooms was only a small part of the answer. But teaching tolerance in the classrooms was getting to more people. And today, 64,000 schools in America use our teaching tolerance material, paid for by over 450,000 people who support the work of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And all of our materials are free. And not to brag, our video, the first one, and our first teaching kit won an Oscar at the Academy Awards. We really spend good money and good time to make these things work. Meetings like this are important. The people that I would like to be talking to tonight are the people that didn't come. You know what? You can talk to them. You can go out one-on-one, and you can talk to them. I think Dr. King probably had the answer, if that was one single answer, and I believe there may well be a solution that will make all of our teaching tolerance programs and the President's Committee and the King groups and the Holy Cross Center, Educational Center and Museum, and all the things that we do will actually make it all work. Dr. King taught it because I do believe in his heart he lived it. And that was a lesson that we all learn in our churches, our synagogues, our mosques, and that is to love one another. I heard that at the Pike Road Baptist Church. I heard it. Love your neighbor as yourself. But I also remember reading in John that says, how can you say that you love God whom you've never seen, yet you love your brother that you see, that you hate your brother that you see? Sorry, Reverend. Get this straight. So I heard it in my church, but you know where I learned it? I want to leave this with you because it's meant a lot to me. I learned it from an old black lady who lost her son to a Klansman's noose. Mrs. Beulah May Donald. This Klan was not just any Klan group. It was the United Klans of America, whose members bombed that church in Birmingham in 1963 that killed those 4 little Sunday school girls. Just a few months after Dr. King's famous speech we've heard so much about tonight. And this, as our country was becoming more conservative and turning to the right in the late 1970s and 80s, as television preachers began to pit one side of us against another, as radio talk show hosts became less civil in their dialogue, as politicians began to use racial code words like welfare and crime and all the other things, the Klan was one step ahead of them. They began to organize. And the United Klans of America had a brand new 10,000 square foot brick building, money in the bank, and they had organizations and chapters in 30 states, many of them here in the state of Texas. In fact, I had come to Galveston Bay, Texas, where one of their Korean organizations was burning Vietnamese fishermen boats and was able to get a court injunction for those people to be able to fish in peace. Well, the leaders of this Klan group looked down in Mobile, Alabama, and they saw something that bothered them. They saw a black man who was being tried in a court of law on criminal charges of killing a white police officer. And what bothered them was the jury in Mobile was majority black. And so they sent word to their local unit in Mobile. They said, if that black man, and I promise you those weren't the words we proved in court they later used, if he gets away with killing that white police officer, find a black person, anyone, and kill him in a public way to send a message that if black people in this nation are going to do things that side on the interests of us white folks, they better be careful. And they chose two young Klansmen, 17-year-old James Tiger Knowles and Henry Hayes, 21 years old. They gave them a rope shaped up like a noose, a gun, and a car, and they all gathered in an apartment house in downtown Mobile to watch the jury verdict being announced on the 10 o'clock news, and it was a deadlocked jury. And it was not along racial lines. But they considered that that was a defeat for them, and so these two young Klansmen got in that car and drove around the streets looking for a black person. They passed several, didn't feel they could get away with kidnapping them, and finally they drove up beside a young man who was walking down the street, minding his business. He was Michael Donald, Mrs. Donald's 19-year-old son. A fine young man, a leader in his church, in his community, a student at Mobile Junior College, and he was coming home from his night job at the Mobile Press Register in the press room. They called him over to the car and asked him directions to a restaurant. He gladly began to show them, and one jumped out, put a pistol on him, forced him in the car, took him across the Bayou Bridge, over into the swamps of Baldwin County, Alabama, put that rope around his neck, and brought him back and hung him from a tree in a black neighborhood, where he was found at daylight the next morning. It took the FBI and the police about 3 years to crack that case, and only then, because the young Klansman James Tiger Knowles couldn't take the pressure, he confessed, and they gave him a life sentence in the Federal Witness Protection Program if he would testify against the older Klansman. And I went to that trial, and I watched, and I saw an all-white jury this time find him guilty, sentenced him to die in the electric chair in Alabama. And even though I oppose the death penalty, I'm just reporting to you what happened. He was executed recently. And at the end of that trial, I asked that young Klansman, would he testify for me in a case against the Klan leaders? Nobody had ever gone against the leaders. It's always the young ones that get to do these acts. And he told me what really happened and the story behind it. And we brought a lawsuit. Mrs. Donald came and sat at the counsel table right in front of that jury. She was a dear lady. I got to know her. Very courageous woman to even go through with such a lawsuit. The Klan had good lawyers representing them. They had money and property. I sued James Tiger Knowles because I wanted the jury to see the whole cast of characters. He had no attorney, but he was in prison for life. But I wanted him to be there too at the counsel table with the Klan. I put him on the stand. He said when we got Michael in the car, he begged us, he said, please, please, don't kill me. Take my money, beat me up, but my mama depends on me. And he said we got him over there and he tried to get away from us in the woods, and we clubbed him and got him to the ground and put the noose around his neck. I put my foot up against one side of his face and the other Klansman the other side of his face, and we pulled on that rope till there was not a breath of life left in him. And I know Mrs. Donald could not have helped but have seen those waffle boot prints still in his side of his face in that color autopsy photograph as I passed it by her to the jury. At the end of the trial, the Klan lawyer argued that they didn't really encourage this death, that they were unpopular, and it would be a bad precedent to rule in such a way against them. I told the jury that we had shown a series of acts this group had done from the bombing of the Birmingham church all the way up to this 1982 lynching, and I'm talking in the late 1980s now before we got to trial. And I said, we've shown that they carried out their policies of white supremacy through violence. And I said, I want you, again, I had an all-white jury. I said, I want you to return a verdict that you will be proud of, that our state and our nation will be proud of. Return a verdict so that when one day, when they call the roll of those who gave their life in the struggle for human dignity, when they call out the name of Medgar Evers and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, ladies and gentlemen, bring back a verdict so they'll call out the name of Michael Donald. I sat down and the judge was telling the jury what the law was when this young Klansman, James Tiger Knowles, jumped to his feet. We thought he was trying to escape from the courtroom. The U.S. Marshals who had brought him grabbed him. He turned to the judge and says, Your Honor, can I say something to the jury? And the judge says, you don't have a lawyer. It's past the time for arguments, but I'll give you 5 minutes. And this young man walked over there. He's now in his mid-20s. He said, ladies and gentlemen, racial hatred brought me to where I am. And I learned at the knees of my family, and now have nothing. And he looked down and said, Mrs. Donald, and his mouth began to quiver and he began to sob. And I thought the judge was going to grant a recess so he could regain his composure. When he cleared his throat, he said, can you forgive me, Mrs. Donald, for what I did to Michael? And she kind of rocked back in her chair and looked at him there in front of that jury, and they were less than 5 feet apart, Mrs. Donald and James Tiger Knowles. And I'll never forget, if I live to be 100, what she said that day in Mobile in that courtroom. She said, son, I've already forgiven you. This lady who lost one of the most precious things in her life, her only son, had the love between a brother and a sister that she could share. She could reach out because she knew this man was a victim. Just like Dr. King says, none of us are free until all of us are free. She knew he was a victim of racism like she had been a victim of racism. She could feel his pain because she had suffered pain. Her people before her, 300 years of slavery and Jim Crow laws, lost opportunities, lost educations, lost fortunes and families, cruelties. And she could reach out because she had that love. And I thought the words that came out of her mouth in front of that jury was a higher justice than that $7 million verdict that jury rendered later that afternoon. And I've thought since many times, as I've struggled and other people have struggled, and I've tried to be a part of something constructive to bridge that gap that divides us so terribly and tragically in this nation, that gap will be bridged, but it will be bridged when we truly follow Mrs. Donald's lesson of love. Because few of us have ever been hurt like that. Few of us stand and look into the face of someone who did the horrible things that happened to her. We didn't forget what happened. We got 2 more Klansmen indicted after that, and they were imprisoned. But she understood. And if we practice that in our communities, with our children and our families, we would be able to have a dialogue among the races. There wouldn't be divisive over words like affirmative action. It'd be over how I can help you. Because, you know, there is no entitlement in this nation to the fruits of our democracy. There is no entitlement. I promise you, I got where I got because of a system that allowed my people to walk across the backs of a lot of other people, less fortunate. We heard a young lady give a partial rendition of one of Dr. King's great speeches, I Have a Dream. We heard a young man give another part, a rendition of that speech. And I predict when the history books are written for the long period of time, when they're reading the speeches of the great Roman orator Cicero and Marcus Aurelius and the Greek orators and Patrick Henry, we will remember and we will read that speech of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Especially the portion he said that I have a dream that one day in the red clay hills of Georgia, that the sons of former slave owners and the sons of former slaves will sit down around the table of brotherhood. And I think if the Reverend Dr. King was here today, seeing 30 years after his tragic death, the 3 steps forward we've taken and the 2 steps back, I think Dr. King might say today, if he was making that speech, and I'll only be presumptuous to put words in a great man's mouth, it would be that I have a dream that one day in the red clay hills of Georgia, but I think today he might add, on the reservations, in the barrios, and in the ghettos, in the seats of economic and political power in this country, that the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners, and I think he might add, the homeless, the powerless, and those who hold the keys to the economic and political power of our democracy will sit down around the table of personhood and love one another. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.